It is past midnight in Washington, and the President of the United States is not asleep. He is standing in a small room above a stable, staring at strips of paper covered in dots and dashes. Outside, armies are scattered across a continent. Some soldiers are 400 miles away, some are 800. There are no phones, no radios, no satellites. And yet, within minutes, this one man in this one room seems to know exactly what is happening on battlefields he has never seen. How is that possible? For most of human history, a general fighting a war hundreds of miles from the capital was, in every practical sense, alone. Orders took weeks to arrive. Reports took weeks to return. By the time a king or a president received news of a battle, the outcome had already been decided by men who had no guidance from home at all. Abraham Lincoln did not have that problem. Somehow, in the middle of the bloodiest war his country had ever fought, he was reaching across enormous distances and touching the war itself, almost as it happened. Historians would later call it his secret weapon. Not a general, not a strategy, something else. Something almost nobody talks about when they tell this story. And it had nothing to do with courage or intelligence or political instinct alone. It started in the summer of 1861. The Union Army had just been humiliated at Bull Run. Soldiers ran, officers panicked. And in Washington, President Lincoln realized something devastating. He was fighting a war he could not see. His generals were brilliant men on paper, West Point graduates, veterans of Mexico, but many of them acted like independent kings, making decisions in isolation, sometimes for weeks before anyone in the capital even knew what they had done. General George McClellan was the worst of them. Slow, cautious, convinced the enemy outnumbered him even when the opposite was true. Lincoln would ask for reports and receive silence. He would ask for movement and receive excuses. Meanwhile, the Confederacy was organizing, recruiting, and building an army of its own. The president tried everything the old world offered. Couriers on horseback, written dispatches carried by rail, officers sent personally to check on generals in the field. None of it worked fast enough. A message from Washington to a general in Tennessee could take days. By the time it arrived, the battlefield had already changed. Napoleon had fought this way. So had every commander before him. War, for thousands of years, moved at the speed of a horse. But Lincoln kept noticing something strange happening just blocks from the White House. In a cramped building belonging to the War Department, a group of young operators sat for hours, tapping out signals that traveled faster than any man could ride. It was called the Military Telegraph Office, and in the early days of the war, almost nobody in Washington understood how much power was sitting inside it. Lincoln started visiting. Then he started staying. Soon he was spending more time in that small telegraph room than almost anywhere else in the capital besides his own house. Staff described him pacing the floor at 2 a.m, reading messages as they came in, sometimes drafting replies himself, word by word, to generals hundreds of miles away. Edwin Stanton, his Secretary of War, noticed it too. So did the small team of operators, men barely in their 20s, who now realized the President of the United States was reading their transcriptions before anyone else in government did. Something had changed. For the first time in the history of warfare, a leader could sit in one city and, within the hour, know what was happening in another one, hundreds of miles away. For centuries, the men who ran wars believed the answer to controlling distance was better riders, faster ships, or smarter couriers. They looked for solutions in speed of travel. But the real answer was never about moving people faster. It was about not needing to move a person at all. The true hero of this story was not a general, and not even Lincoln's political genius alone. It was a thin strand of ordinary copper wire, strung on wooden poles across fields, rivers, and mountains, carrying nothing but pulses of electricity. Cheap, unglamorous, barely noticed by the men who used it every day. By 1861, the United States had been building telegraph lines for nearly 2 decades, mostly for business and news. Nobody had designed this network to win a war. But when the fighting started, the government quietly took control of it, expanded it, and turned it into something no army in history had ever possessed: a nervous system stretched across an entire country. This single, humble material, this metal wire, was about to reorganize the entire structure of the war. Once Lincoln understood what the telegraph could do, everything about how the Union fought began to shift. Stanton's War Department, right next to that telegraph office, became the true command center of the war. Not a battlefield tent, a room full of wires and paper strips. Union generals could no longer disappear into isolation. Ulysses S. Grant, unlike McClellan, understood this instantly. He used the telegraph constantly, coordinating movements across multiple armies at once, something that had been physically impossible for any commander before him. In 1864, Grant directed forces in Virginia, Georgia, and the Mississippi Valley almost simultaneously, adjusting plans within hours based on messages relayed by wire. The telegraph did not just move information faster, it moved power. Washington could now issue orders and confirm they had been followed, all in the same day. A general who ignored instructions could no longer hide behind distance. The president was, quite literally, watching. The economic side of the war transformed just as dramatically. Wall Street prices, gold values, and government bond sales were relayed instantly along the same copper lines, allowing the Union Treasury to react to financial pressure in real time, something the Confederacy, with its weaker telegraph network, consistently failed to match. Railroads depended on the same wires to schedule troop movements without deadly collisions, coordinating thousands of soldiers and tons of supplies across a rapidly growing rail system. Newspapers received battlefield updates within hours instead of weeks, shaping public opinion in the North while the war was still being fought, not after it was already over. Even Lincoln's most famous political document rode this invisible network. When the Emancipation Proclamation went into effect, telegraph wires carried the news across the Union almost instantly, reaching newspapers and military commanders in a single day, a feat that would have taken weeks in any war before this one. By the end of the conflict, the Union had strung together thousands of miles of telegraph line, operated by a small corps of overworked young men who rarely appear in history textbooks. Their wires, more than any single battlefield victory, gave Lincoln something no wartime leader had ever truly had before: real-time awareness of an entire, sprawling conflict. Go back to that room above the stable, past midnight, strips of paper covering the floor. Lincoln is not a magician. He does not have some supernatural insight into the battlefield. He simply has access to something almost invisible, something running under the ground and along fence posts across the entire country, carrying the war to him in electric pulses. That thin copper wire is still around you right now. It runs behind your walls. It sits inside the device you are using this very moment. It is buried under city streets, coiled inside routers, hidden behind the screens people stare at every single day, unnoticed, unglamorous, and completely essential. Abraham Lincoln understood something almost everyone else missed. The Civil War would not be won by battlefield courage alone. It would be won by whoever could see the whole war at once and act faster than the enemy could react. He found that advantage in a wire nobody else thought to watch. And in the end, it was not the man in the room who won the war. It was what quietly connected him to everything happening far beyond it.